I look at this as a good thing. A lot of people see population decline as the end of the world, and I just don't think it is. Then, once you got past Gen X into the millennials had way less kids, maybe only one or two each. And it seems like Gen Z, my generation, of course, is like having next to none. This earth is temporary, right? And if we want it to last as long as we can, the only logical thing to do is probably decrease population. Because at least for the things we know now and the things we do now, the more people we add, the more problems we're going to have in the future. AiA episode 49, talking about the UN population reports from 2022 and comparing it to 2017, while also diving a little bit into antinatalism. So anyways, this episode will be heavy on population and quite boring overall. So this basically, I'm trying to warn you, if you are watching this episode, it's going to be quite of a dry episode, but I think this is very interesting because, I don't know, maybe I'm just very autistic, but I love population. I love talking about it. I love looking at numbers, graphs, statistics, but I won't go too deep into that for this episode, but I have read this entire 2022 report. I've also read the entire 2017 report, but a couple years ago. I only scanned through it before this episode. But the main point I wanted to hit on was the actual number the UN was predicting in population. So if you look right here, one of their key points is for the global population growth is that around 8.5 billion people by 2030 globally, 9.7 billion by 2050, and 10.4 billion by 2100. Now, if you don't know anything about population projections or anything that the UN has said in the past, those numbers might sound, normal. You might take them as face value and not even look at statistics and be like, okay, that seems to be the case. But if you go to their 2017 report, which, by the way, all of the things I talk about, all these tabs will be linked down in the description. So all these reports, the video I watch, and everything I talk about here. But if you look at the 2017 report, you can see that the numbers seem quite favorable. We have 8.6 billion, so versus 8.5. It's not a big difference. And then you have 9.8 instead of 9.7 by 2050. Not a big difference, but 11.2 billion by 2100. Now, to a lot of people, if you don't think about that a lot, it might sound quite normal. But let's just think about that a little bit. So this was the 2017 report, by the way. This was 5 years ago. And now the report that came out this year, they're predicting 10.4 billion people by 2100. But just 5 years prior, they were predicting 11.2 billion by 2100. That's a difference of 800 million people, by the way. Almost a billion people difference that they are predicting. To me, that's quite concerning when you actually start doing population projections. Because 800 million people is bigger than any single country on Earth except for China and India. So I don't know where that 800 million went, but in 5 years, they saw the birth rates and they saw, people having kids. The average number of people having kids has drastically dropped a lot. And it does come down to that. I mean, if you look at the young male virginity, I know I've talked about this before, it is very, very high in the United States. Now, this was taken in the United States, at least the survey was. And it shows that 27% of men age 18 to 30 are virgins and have no sexual activity. This is almost 1/3 of men. And if you look at the date, it shows 2018. So this is pre-COVID numbers. I bet if this same survey was taken in the United States after COVID, we could be seeing numbers in the 40s, maybe even half. I would go as far as to say probably half of the males nowadays age probably 18 to 25, maybe not 18 to 30, but at least 18 to 25 are probably virgins, because it seems to be the case if we were in lockdown for, 2 years dealing with COVID, and, that really put a strain on, because an interesting thing happened while actually we were in COVID is that a lot of the, population predictors and just predictors in general were basically saying there's going to be a baby boom during COVID because a lot of people are going to be stuck at home having sex. But that actually was the opposite. People did not have a lot of sex. A lot of people became very depressed and didn't really know how to cope with being locked down. And I think that COVID has definitely accentuated the population decline, because this numbers here from 2017 were obviously pre-COVID, and the 2022 numbers are after COVID. So I think that's very important to look at. And I also wanted to show you some key graphs here. So let me see if I can find the graph that I wanted to show. So here is the graph that is the biggest one that a lot of people are really looking at. So basically, if you don't know what the replacement rate is, or the replacement fertility rate, this is a number which is considered what 2.1 is. So the reason the replacement rate is at 2.1 is because if every couple on Earth, every man and woman got together and they had 2 kids, then the population would slowly decrease over time. And the reason being is because not everyone has kids, obviously, because in a perfect world, that means you would have like 2 people, a man and a woman, both straight, because not everyone's straight in this world. Not everyone has kids. And that's why it is 2.1. And if it drops below 2.1, the population will slowly decrease over time. And the reason is that a lot of at least areas, or like areas that are shown in this graph here, are actually already below the 2.1. They're not having enough kids to replace their population. So the ones that are already below the 2.1 replacement rate, which we have Latin America here, we have the light green line, which is Australia and New Zealand. We have this blue line, which is Eastern and Southeastern Asia, which at one point was all the way up here, now all the way down here, which is at like 1.6 maybe. And then we have, of course, Europe and North America, which is the biggest one that's struggling right now. People just are not having kids in the West, and they haven't been having kids for a while. It was basically in the 1970s that it fell below the replacement fertility rate, and it has never gone above since. And it really hasn't even had any spikes. It's been basically a slow decline since really the 60s. I don't see an uptick at all whatsoever in this graph. I mean, maybe right here, right when the recession happened in 2008, the global recession, but it seems like right after 2010, it seemed to be going down again. And obviously, every single other area here seems to be going down in the graph as well. And I think the important one to look at is obviously the world. So we have this black line here, which is the world's fertility rate. And you can see that by 2050, it seems to be approaching that line. And once the world's fertility rate actually reaches below the replacement fertility rate, that's when the population will officially start declining. And a lot of people argue back and forth that will the population keep increasing until 2100, until the end of the century, or will it start decreasing a little bit after 2050? I'm actually going to predict that it probably will start decreasing after 2050, just based on the fertility rates and the sort of attitude from the younger generation of having kids. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to look at this and say, like, young males just really aren't interested in having kids anymore. Now, again, I'm not trying to say it's a bad or good thing. I'm just saying that they have a lot of other accessibility that they can have, just basically at their fingertips. Things like porn, for instance. Porn has always been something that, was hard to get for a while. It hasn't really been a thing. Well, it's been a thing in human history, but it's only became digitalized in the past like 30 years. But it's became very accessible in the past 10 years. And you can see ever since 2008, the male virginity rate has been going up significantly. And I would kind of argue in 2008, that's kind of when porn became really accessible online, and you could just look up porn videos and stuff. And I think a lot of young males just kind of use that. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that that's probably a huge contributing factor when it actually comes to the population decline, because you can see, at least, this is one thing that is across all populations, is that the more developed a country is, the less likely people are to have kids. Mainly, the biggest factors, I would say, are women's education and women's opportunities. When women have opportunities in education, they tend to not want to have kids, or at least push that off long enough to where they can't have kids anymore. And it seems like with the most developed countries in the world, like for instance, Europe and North America, which was basically the most industrialized, the fastest, its population decreased and has been decreasing ever since. And the only reason, well, their fertility rate's been decreasing, but the only reason their populations are still increasing, like for instance in the UK or the United States or Canada, is because they take in so many immigrants. So obviously they take in more immigrants a year. You know, I think the US takes in about 1 million immigrants a year, maybe even more. And that's the reason the United States population is still increasing to this day. This is census.gov. It basically shows a live counter of the population increasing in the United States. We have 1 birth every 8 seconds and 1 death every 12 seconds. But we also have 1 net international migrant every 126 seconds. So basically a net person every 23 seconds. And the US population is still increasing, in fact, and it's still projected to increase for a while, actually. That's the sort of surprising thing about the United States population, because the United States fertility rate has not been above replacement since the 1970s. You can look up any data point on this. But the reason the population is still increasing is because of migrants, and we take in so many immigrants a year. So that's the only reason the United States is still increasing to this day. But it seems to be the correlation of the more developed a country is, you know, obviously the more liberal they are, they have more rights to women that have opportunities, and they can actually go out and get educated and pursue higher education, go to college, get their own career, be self-sufficient and independent. They are able to obviously live on their own and not really rely on a man. And if they don't have to rely on a man, then they're probably not going to have a kid at that point. And a lot of women, at least in liberal society, especially here in the United States, that seems to be a big draw for them, is that they want to be independent, they want to go to college, they want to have a career, they want to be self-sufficient, which all power to them. I don't see that as wrong in any way. I know that conservatives, or at least traditionalist, religious Christians seem to have a big problem with that. But that seems to be the case in a more liberal, industrialized society. But if you look at other regions of the world that aren't as industrialized, so if we look at this purple line here, that is sub-Saharan Africa, which is probably the least industrialized place in the world. As you can see, their fertility rate is all the way up here at like 7 and 6. And even at the year we're at 5 right now. That's 5 kids per family. And if you go all the way out to 2050, it seems to be dropping to 3, which is a lot more manageable. But you can see that a lot of these other places that already are very industrialized, that's why their replacement rate is so low. And I think this is the most significant graph when it comes to actually looking at population, because it shows that the more industrialized places in the world seem to have, you know, less fertility. But I look at this as a good thing. A lot of people see population decline as the end of the world, and I just don't think it is. The reason I don't see population decline as the end of the world is it just goes to show how industrialized the world is, because there are countries now that are losing population because they are so industrialized. But I look at that as a good thing. That shows that women in those countries actually have careers and they have jobs and they are self-sufficient on their own, and they are not having kids because it is industrialized enough and it is equal enough to where anyone in that country can be able to pursue careers and be self-sufficient on their own. You can look at places as famous like Japan, for instance. They've been declining in population for a bit now, but they seem to be doing really good GDP-wise and really good in their country-wise. Now, again, you can also make the argument that the men there are sort of rapey in a way of how they interact with themselves, because they don't even know how to interact with a woman, but they rather jerk off on subways on the way to work than even have a wife or have kids, which, again, I don't necessarily know if that's a good or bad thing, but personally, seeing the population decline to me is a good sign of the world becoming industrialized. But obviously, when we talk about like the industrialized world and we talk about this global industrialized world that we're creating, we have to think about the resources we're using and if we have enough to actually sustain the world population we're at. So I wanted to, obviously, I didn't want to go too deep into this report because I know it is, quite a long report. I think it's 52 pages. Yeah, 52 pages. So I'm not going to go too deep into the report. Oh yeah, I also wanted to hit on just this prediction. So this prediction here was basically like the high and low scores of like certain organizations when it came to population. And the high UN score is all the way up here at like 15 billion. And the medium UN score is right here at around just over 10 billion. But their low UN score is all the way down here at basically at what we're at right now, around 7 billion people. I would definitely bid the lower that we're probably going to end up maybe even not even reaching 10 billion people. I know that sounds crazy to say, but I don't even see us reaching 10 billion people by the end of the century, just based on how industrialized the world is getting. And it seems to be the attitude from millennials and Gen Z of not having kids, or at least not having a lot of kids. Because you have to remember that you can have 1 or 2 kids, and that's not going to increase the population of the world. Will it slow the population decline? Yes, but if you're not having 3, 4, 5 kids, you're not increasing the population at that point. You're just sustaining it. So basically, I found this video that was quite interesting to me, and this is from Chris Williamson, and he had Jordan Peterson on his podcast. So Jordan Peterson seems to be a proponent, just like Elon Musk in this.
Rolling the clock forward.
Where he seems to perpetuate this idea that population is going to collapse in the next couple of decades, which obviously, if you look at the numbers, that's not going to happen. But again, this is something that an idea that Elon Musk is definitely perpetuating, and obviously Jordan Peterson is too. So this is quite an interesting video. Let's see what Jordan Peterson has to say, Chris Williamson, and as always, this video will be linked down in the description. So please give Chris Williamson the support he deserves. He's definitely a really good podcaster. I've listened to a couple of his podcasts. He is amazing, and the film editing he does is also amazing as well.
Rolling the clock forward, you and Elon tweeted recently about population collapse. What do you think is going to happen there?
Oh, well, I've thought for at least 10 years that the biggest problem in 50 years will be that there's just not enough people.
I remember hearing you say a few years ago that you thought we'd peak at about 9 billion.
Yeah, we probably won't hit 9. Yeah. And I knew the stats because...
Think about how crazy it is to think that we might be living on Earth right now at a time with the most number of humans that are ever going to exist at one time ever.
Yeah.
I mean, while that is an interesting thought, that just really doesn't seem to be the case, because if you look at the numbers, and especially how, again, you can look at Africa, for instance, I mean, that's probably the biggest thing that a lot of these people just don't seem to be looking at, is that Africa's growth rate is insane at the moment. And again, it doesn't look like it's going to go down below replacement fertility rate until probably like the 2070s or 2080s. So as long as Africa stays this high up in fertility rates, the world population looks like it's not going to collapse anytime soon, or even start decreasing, because Africa brings in so many new people every year. Now, yes, the decline from other regions of the world is very possible. We know that, but Africa brings in a ton of people.
Yeah, that's highly probable. And, and the population...
That blows my mind.
The population collapse in developed countries is precipitous, right? It's like we fall off a cliff.
Because it's the same as everyone knows this from the pandemic, the R0 number. If fewer people are reproducing, next generation you have fewer people to reproduce as fewer people are reproducing, and it...
Yeah.
And
well, I worked on a UN committee, it's got to be 10 years ago now, to help draft the UN Secretary General's report on sustainable economic development. And so I looked at all sorts of things like that. I was very curious, for example, about, because people have been beating the overpopulation drum since, well, it really kicked in the 1960s, because there were dire predictions. By the year 2000, the Club of Rome came out and said, well, there'll be riots and mass starvation and mass movement of migrants and all the things you hear about climate change. because there's too many people on the planet. And that just didn't happen at all. That was just that. It wasn't just wrong. It was anti-true. It was absolutely wrong. What happened instead was that everyone.
Well, I think the problem there is that in like the 1950s, 60s, 70s, there was that idea perpetuated like, oh my gosh, we're going to overpopulate the Earth by the year 2000, which again, looking at the numbers then would have told you a different story. But the biggest difference is that Gen Xers had much less kids than the baby boomers did. And then once you got past Gen X into the millennials had way less kids, maybe only one or two each. And it seems like Gen Z, my generation, of course, is like having next to none. And why is this? Again, there's a lot of factors, but you can probably look at the sense of like there are more people in developed countries now. Countries are developing faster. Women's education and women opportunities are getting so much better. And also, I mean, just look at it from a financial standpoint. If you are living in the United States right now, and even if you live on like an average income, like the average guy in the United States or average woman too, basically makes around like $40,000 a year. And even if they're together with their money, let's say they're making about $80,000 a year. And just looking how expensive things are after the pandemic now, after we've gotten out of COVID in 2022 with inflation going on and such, I think a lot of people are looking at, even couples, for instance, are like, it is very expensive just for us to live. Like we might be doing okay, but bringing in another person is extremely hard. And that's a lot of people's reality in the United States, is that it's very expensive just to live on your own in the United States. So imagine, having a kid or even having two or three, because even if we're just talking about one kid, that's not going to raise the population. It's still going to decline. Now it will decline slower, but it'll still decline. Even if you're having two kids, the population is still technically declining, very slowly, of course, but again, still is. And then you have to talk about if the population is actually increasing, you would have to have like 3 kids. And for most people, that is just not financially possible, at least in the United States, from my perspective, if you're making an average salary.
Everyone got way richer, and the bottom section of the population in terms of economic distribution got lifted out of poverty. Inequality still exists, but that's that power law phenomenon we already talked about. Not that that's trivial, it's just unbelievably difficult to determine what to do with. There are solutions, but certainly getting rid of capitalism isn't the solution. And so I looked at population trends and first of all found, not that this is an act of genius or anything, that as soon as you educate women, the size of family shrinks precipitously, like below replacement. And that's partly because women have other options. That's a huge part.
We're seeing this play out.
Oh, yes. I mean, all the countries in the West are way below replacement. Korea's way below replacement. South Korea, Japan, way below replacement. Yeah.
I think the number one on the planet might be Chad. Chad, the country.
In terms of growth?
8 children on average.
Yeah, I think Nigeria will have more people in it than China by the end of the century. So, yeah. And Musk, he's a far-looking man, and so he's looking around the apocalyptic corner, let's say, and like, we're running out of people. And what that means, of course, is that you run out of young people, right? You don't run out of old people first, because everyone who is here now is going to be 30 years older in 30 years, and it'll be young people we don't have enough of. And of course, young people are the ones who do the innovation and are going to do most of the heavy lifting, etc. And so there's going to be a terrible shortage of young people.
Well, you see this with some of the things that I posted, that ONS data, the 50.1% of women childless by 30. And both men and women are replying to that tweet saying, well, good, there's too many people on the planet in any case.
I know.
I'm thinking how this NPC midwittery is so dangerous, because it makes people believe that they actually have something grounded backing up their claims.
Yeah.
Well, I do think they have something grounded backing up their claims. I mean, just look at how many resources we have on Earth. They're limited at the end of the day. Like, yeah, of course, we can find sustainable options and, being able to have better energy and just better resource allocation. But at the end of the day, you really have to look at it and say, this Earth is temporary, right? And if we want it to last as long as we can, the only logical thing to do is probably decrease population, because at least for the things we know now and the things we do now, the more people we add, the more problems we're going to have in the future.
Yeah, well, and this idea that the planet has too many people on it, there's no sentiment more implicitly genocidal than that statement. So what do you mean too many people? Exactly. And what do you mean the planet? And what do you propose to do about that exactly? Mass abortion, is that your answer? Or should we do something a little more dramatic? Maybe we'll just shame people out of having children. And I've seen people do that, literally. I saw a professor when I was at a TED, I think it was doesn't matter. It was a number of professors talking to a couple hundred students. And one of the professors, who was an environmentalist activist type, and he got up on stage and shook his finger to the whole young crowd, saying that him and his wife had only decided to have one child, which was, in my opinion, one child too many for him. And told all the young people there, if they had a shred of ethical decency, that they would severely limit their reproductive potential. And I stood up and said that I thought that was one of the most appalling things I'd ever heard anyone in academia say to young people, which is really saying something, because they say plenty of appalling things. And it was a very uncomfortable moment, and he huffed off the stage. But, in a frenzy, talking about how you couldn't talk about such things without being pilloried on ethical grounds. And yeah, that's for sure. You come out as a emissary of the academic establishment. You tell young people that humanity is so corrupt that they should seriously consider not propagating, because that violates the deepest of ethical norms, and you think that's a good thing and that's your right. And it was just beyond comprehension. It's beyond comprehension, but it's associated with like a deeply rooted existential self-hatred. I mean hatred at the level of humanity is like a virus on the planet, that we're a cancerous growth.
Alex Epstein calls this human race.
I mean, if you're talking about like the humans are a virus on the planet, I mean, look what we do to it. It's not like we are helping the planet in many ways. I mean, we do help it in some ways when it comes to like nature reserves and stuff, like preserving nature. I think that's a good thing. But when it comes to like everything else we do with our overconsumption and overuse of plastics and our, use of fossil fuels and like non-renewable energy, that stuff is going to run out, and probably putting more and more CO2 in the air is not a good thing. And I think looking at that from that perspective, from the environmental perspective, a lot of environmentalists are like, hey, if we have less people and we have better like resources and like better resource allocation and use different resource types like renewable energy, maybe then, we can have a sustainable population, which I totally agree with. Because at the end of the day, I think the world will be just fine with like 1 billion people on it. We don't need 10 billion people. And, if we had more renewable resources and if we had sustainable resources, like we're not using fossil fuels for our energy, maybe then the world would have like less CO2 in the air, and we would have a resource cycle we can use. And just the world would be a better and healthier place, I think. I think, honestly, that it is a better future for Earth than having a larger and larger population, a larger consumption of plastic, a larger consumption of, fossil fuels. Eventually we're going to run out, and maybe it won't be now or 10, 20, 100 years, 200 years in the future, but eventually we will. And I think we need to think about that when we get to that point, whenever that point might be in the future, of saying, hey, maybe if we have less people in the future, this might actually be a good thing, because then when we have to like totally change our resources and stuff, maybe not billions of people will die, but maybe only a couple million or something. But I don't know. That's just my opinion on that.
Racism.
Right.
And it's that.
Yeah. Well, we're a cancer on the planet, unchecked growth, just like a cancer. It's like, that's us, a cancer. It's okay. We know where your heart is located. Because what's the implications for a doctrine like that? What do you do with the cancer?
Cut it out.
Yeah, that's for sure. Poison it or whatever. There's nothing you don't do to a cancer. So you're going to use a metaphor like that? There's too many people on the planet. You're going to use a metaphor like that? And then you're going to also decide that you're virtuous while you're using it because you're on the side of the planet, whatever the hell that means. So yeah, it's unbelievable, and a huge part of it's rooted in this existential shame and horror at the condition of being human, and the fact that life is rife with suffering, and a lot of it's unjustified. And it's a Mephistophelian position. So Mephistopheles was laid out, portrayed in Goethe's Faust. That's the story of a man who sold his soul to the devil for knowledge. It's a story of intellectual pride, and Goethe stands in relationship to German literature in the same manner that Shakespeare stands in relationship to English literature. And Goethe's Mephistopheles says straight out twice in the play, once in the first, there's 2 books, and once in the first book and once in the second. Goethe has him restate it twice. Existence is such a foul thing because of all its suffering, essentially, that it would be better if it was merely annihilated. And that's the Mephistophelian stance. This whole show should just come to a halt. Look at how corrupt people are. Evil reigns everywhere. It's nothing but will to power. We're destroying the planet with our unchecked ambition, all of it rooted in greed and Machiavellianism and jockeying for position. And we're so contemptible that we should just roll up and die. And we should shame women into not having children. And we should shame men so they never manifest any planet-destroying ambition. And it's unbelievably appalling. It goes all the way down to the bottom of things. That's what's tearing our culture apart, this dispute about the nature of existence at the most fundamental level. So, and the universities have come out on the wrong side.
What's happening, people?
So that was Jordan Peterson and Chris Williamson's take on the population collapse theory. Definitely wanted to show that video, kind of give my opinions on it. But the last thing I wanted to talk about in the show was a sort of philosophy kind of Jordan Peterson was hitting on at the end there, and that's antinatalism. So basically what antinatalism is that it is morally wrong and cannot be justified for having kids. So this is a philosophy that basically says if you're having kids, you're doing a wrong because you cannot justify it in any way. Basically because for some reason, the world, like Jordan Peterson was saying, like it's completely dark, everyone's corrupt, everyone is just so mean and will to power and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, even though you can acknowledge that there are wrongs and, darkness in the world, there's also light and like good experiences because, at least for what I would say, for, me living on this earth for 22 years now, is that, I've had a lot of good experiences and bad experiences too, but I think they level out, and I think overall existence is quite nice. But I guess it does have to come to an end, like Jordan Peterson said. But yeah, antinatalism, I wanted to talk about the subreddit a little bit. I will link it down in the description. I definitely recommend doing some research on it and kind of just reading some posts, kind of getting a feel to it, because it is quite a, I would say, interesting subreddit. But I also wanted to talk about the age demographic of antinatalism. Now, again, this is just one poll. This is not, this is just a poll I found, but I know they do this like every year of like, how old are you when it comes to an antinatalist? And this is a very, very heavy millennial and Gen X philosophy. So basically, as you can tell, is that every person who is Gen X and older, they are 40, I think, 2 as of now. I think it's 2022. So I think if you were born in 1980 and before, you were Gen Xer. So this is people that are like 42 and above. So obviously this is not for Gen X, and baby boomers, I think, are like 59 or 60s now. So they're not even like on this list here. But obviously it's not popular when it comes to Gen X. Gen Alpha, I think that's the newest generation in the past 10 years, but obviously we don't hear about them because they're all really young. But apparently there's some people that are under 10 on this subreddit, which is crazy, but heavily a Gen Z millennial philosophy. So basically, I think the oldest Gen Zer now is about 25. I think they were born in 1997. So that would be 25 because it's 2022, and obviously a millennial one because the millennials are now in their late 20s and 30s, and some have hit 40 now. So this is heavily a millennial and Gen Z philosophy. So what does that really come of? But I guess the interesting thing to look at is, as I've said before, is that what it comes down to is that the baby boomers had a lot of kids. Gen Zers or Gen Xers did not have that many. And then when it got to millennials, the people that were born in the 80s and after, didn't have many kids to begin with. And then once it hit 1997, and then the Gen Zers took over, it doesn't seem like many Gen Zers are having any kids whatsoever. I mean, the millennials did have a decent amount, but it wasn't anything crazy. Definitely not in replacement rate, but Gen Z has barely had any kids at all. Now, again, I would like to say it's more to do with like finances. Stuff is very expensive nowadays. I don't think anyone is arguing that. But I think that's the most important thing to look at now. And obviously, you can talk about development, women's education, women opportunities. But I would say it's very expensive to live now. At least when it comes down to it, you can think back and like, hey, if you were making 40, 50K a year, you might be able to support a family. But making 40, 50K a year, you can barely live on your own just as a single person. So imagine having a family and only making an average salary of 40 to 50K. It's going to be quite difficult. So for a lot of people, they don't have kids. And the more rich you are, actually, interesting statistic, the more well-educated and the more rich you are, the more likely you are not to have kids, which is quite interesting as well. For some reason, education basically leads you to not having kids. I don't know why that is, but a lot less people with PhDs and master's degrees and like higher education, even just bachelor's degrees, just aren't having kids. I don't know what that is to do with education. That, I don't know, maybe you spend those years in college and then you get out and you sort of like are figuring out life. And then before you know it, you're 30 and then it's like you haven't had kids yet. And then you think you're too old. I don't know. But that's sort of my belief. I think it's a multi-factor sort of problem. I can't really give a coherent answer on it, but I would definitely recommend checking out Antinatalism, kind of reading into it, because it seems to be a young person's philosophy nowadays. Would I say I'm an antinatalist? No, I wouldn't say that, because when I think about antinatalism, I don't just think of like it's morally wrong to just have kids, because at the end of the day, you can still give them good experiences and good lives. But obviously, if you're like, sort of on the poverty line and you sort of don't have a good financial situation, well, then I would kind of make the argument like, yeah, maybe having kids in a poverty environment is not the smartest thing to do. But anyways, I think that's about it for this podcast. I will wrap it up. I wanted to say I'm very sorry for an episode not coming out last week. That was actually the first time in 48 weeks of doing this show that I have missed a week. And that was because I reacted to a video that was copyrighted and I couldn't upload this podcast, which was supposed to be on last week. But anyways, schedule should go back to normal. Really apologize for not uploading an episode last week, but I did upload a debate I had with an individual I was on, I was on their podcast. But anyways, all of the links will be down in the description down below as always. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, see ya.